Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we've got a billionaire Prime Minister and a billionaire Prime Minister, both of whose families have used schemes to avoid millions of pounds of tax, smearing a working-class woman.
1 minute ago, Britain witnessed a political earthquake that will be remembered for generations. The UK Supreme Court has issued a historic and devastating ruling, calling for the resignation of Prime Minister Keir Starmer. What was once hailed as a story of integrity, justice and redemption has now collapsed into a scandal so deep, so shocking, that it threatens the very foundations of British democracy. This is not just the downfall of a politician. This is the unravelling of a promise, the betrayal of a nation, and the rise of the greatest political scandal in modern history. Keir Starmer's journey began as a story of hope. He was not born into politics, but into the law, a barrister who carried with him the image of fairness, discipline, and unshakable principle. To the people, he was a man who stood apart from the endless carousel of career of politicians. In his speeches, he spoke of truth. In his campaigns, he promised justice. He built an identity as the antidote to corruption, the man who would cleanse Westminster after years of scandal and deceit. Ordinary citizens, exhausted by broken promises, looked to him as more than just a leader. They looked to him as a saviour who could restore trust in a system that seemed beyond repair. Labour MPs rallied around his banner, describing him as the figure who would bring back dignity to public life. The media celebrated his rise as a new dawn, a chance for Britain to reset after a decade of disillusionment. But behind the glow of this carefully crafted image, shadows were already forming. The same speeches that filled halls with applause began to mask whispers of doubt. Rumours that seemed faint, almost irrelevant, started to circulate among rivals and journalists. They spoke of inconsistencies, of numbers that did not add up, of connections that raised uneasy questions. At first, these whispers were dismissed as noise, the usual poison of politics. Starmer stood tall, brushing them aside with his trademark calm, assuring the nation that he had nothing to hide. His words carried weight, and for a time, people believed him. They wanted to believe him. Britain needed a figure of integrity, and Starmer had crafted himself into exactly that. Yet history has a cruel way of rewriting itself. What appeared to be a promise of renewal was only the beginning of a tragedy. The rise of Keir Starmer was not just a story of a man climbing the political ladder. It was the construction of a fragile illusion, one that would shatter under the weight of truth. The very qualities that made him untouchable, his reputation for honesty, his claim to be different, would become the weapons that destroyed him. For when the Supreme Court delivered its judgment, it did not simply expose corruption. It dismantled the image that Britain had once trusted. It stripped away the mask and revealed the man beneath. A leader accused not of error, but of betrayal. And from that moment, the rise of Keir Starmer became inseparable from his fall. At first, the warning signs were faint, barely noticed beyond the murmur of political gossip. A missing detail here, a delayed declaration there. A property record that seemed oddly incomplete. An unexplained gift, left off the official register. These were the kind of irregularities that politicians are often accused of, the kind of noise that is quickly dismissed as partisan attacks. But with Keir Starmer, the weight of expectation was different. He had built his rise on the promise of being better, better than the Tories, better than the scandals of the past, better than the system itself, and so even the smallest whisper against him carried a sharper edge. For the man who claimed to be incorruptible, even the hint of corruption was enough to plant seeds of doubt. Journalists began to dig deeper. At first, their investigations were brushed aside as speculation. But slowly, their discoveries began to connect into something far more troubling. They found inconsistencies in his financial declarations, gaps that no one could explain. Properties linked to his name were missing from the official records. Gifts worth thousands were quietly left undeclared. And though Starmer dismissed these findings as clerical errors, the whispers refused to fade. Instead, they grew louder, echoing through Westminster, slipping into the headlines and capturing the public's imagination. Behind closed doors, his advisers grew restless. Some urged him to come clean, to explain, to confront the rumours before they consumed him. But Starmer, calm on the surface, yet increasingly cornered, chose defiance. He insisted he had nothing to hide, that his enemies were trying to destroy him, that the old establishment feared his reforms. For a while, that defiance worked. His words still carried authority, and the public still wanted to trust him. But authority is fragile, and trust is paper thin. The more he denied, the more the evidence grew. Then came the leaks. Documents that painted a darker picture than anyone expected. Offshore accounts linked to shadowy donors, billionaire connections that clashed with his image of integrity, luxury perks provided quietly behind the scenes. What had once been whispers now took form on paper. Names, dates and numbers that no denial could erase. The scandal was no longer a story of errors, it was the outline of something deliberate, something orchestrated, something that looked less like oversight and more like betrayal. And then the pressure began to mount, not only from the press, but from within his own circle. Labour MPs who had once championed him started to distance themselves, unwilling to be dragged into the quicksand of his growing scandal. Private meetings turned tense. Allies whispered about alternatives. Loyalty, once his strongest weapon, began to fracture. For the first time since his rise, Keir Starmer looked vulnerable. Yet even as the walls began to close in, he held to his stance that he was innocent, that the attacks were political, that he would not bend. But history shows that it is not the whisper of scandal that destroys a leader. It is the roar of truth when the evidence becomes undeniable, and that roar was about to arrive in the form of the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court had taken notice, and when its investigation began, Britain's faith in its Prime Minister began to crumble. The illusion was breaking. The cracks had spread too far, and what had begun as faint whispers of doubt was about to explode into the loudest scandal in modern British history when the Supreme Court announced it was opening an investigation into Keir Starmer. The atmosphere across Britain shifted overnight. This was not the noise of tabloids or the whispers of rivals. This was the voice of the highest court in the land, a voice that could not be ignored. Suddenly, what had been dismissed as speculation was now evidence under the harsh light of judicial scrutiny. The nation held its breath for weeks. Headlines screamed of sealed files, secret testimonies and mountains of evidence being examined behind closed doors. Starmer's allies insisted it was nothing more than a political witch hunt. His critics declared it the beginning of the end. But everyone knew one truth: the judgment of the Supreme Court would be final. Then came the revelations. The judges uncovered a damning trail of corruption that tore apart the very image Starmer had built his career on. There were missing records of over £124,000 in luxury gifts. There were offshore transactions linked to shell companies and donors hidden behind layers of secrecy. And there were communications, emails, memos, instructions that painted a picture not of oversight but of intent. The court documents were explicit. This was not negligence. This was deliberate concealment. A prime minister enriching himself and his allies while publicly vowing to defend integrity. The Supreme Court did not soften its words. In a ruling broadcast live to the nation, the judges declared that Starmer had broken the public trust and placed himself above the law. It was a verdict as blunt as it was devastating. Never in living memory had Britain seen a sitting Prime Minister condemned so directly by its highest judges. And the ruling did not stop at condemnation, it carried a demand. The court ordered Starmer to resign immediately, declaring that no individual, not even the Prime Minister, could stand above the rule of law. The impact was instantaneous. Within minutes of the televised judgment, protests erupted across London. Westminster Square filled with furious crowds waving banners that screamed "Resign now" and chanting "No one is above the law." Social media exploded with fury, hashtags trending worldwide as citizens vented their anger. Opposition leaders seized the moment, calling for immediate elections, while even Starmer's own party began to fracture under the unbearable weight of the court's words. A senior Labour MP, once one of his closest allies, went live on national television to brand him a disgrace to the office of Prime Minister. Inside number 10, chaos reigned. Advisers resigned mid-meeting. Civil servants whispered of mutiny. Ministers drafted letters of no confidence as the machinery of government began to freeze around him. But the man at the centre of the storm refused to bow. In a defiant broadcast to the nation, Starmer dismissed the ruling as politically motivated, a judicial coup, he called it, designed to strip him of power. His words were not calming. They were incendiary. For the first time in centuries, Britain faced a Prime Minister openly rejecting the authority of its highest court. The scandal had now transformed into something far larger than financial misconduct. This was no longer just about gifts, donors, or offshore accounts. This was about the survival of British democracy itself. The court had spoken, the people were rising, and yet the Prime Minister clung to power in open defiance. A constitutional crisis had erupted, one that pushed Britain into uncharted waters. The atmosphere turned electric, part outrage, part disbelief, part fear, as the country confronted the possibility that its leader was willing to tear down the very foundations of law to preserve his grip on office. And so the question that now echoed through Parliament, through protests, through every home and street of Britain, was as chilling as it was simple. What happens when a leader refuses to obey the law? The moment Keir Starmer defied the Supreme Court, Britain crossed a line from which there was no return. What began as whispers of scandal had now become a constitutional earthquake, shaking every corner of the nation. The streets of London erupted like a boiling cauldron, Westminster Square filled with tens of thousands of protesters, their chants echoing through the historic halls of Parliament. Resign now, lock him up. Placards painted in red and black waved above the crowds, capturing the fury of a nation that felt betrayed by the very man who once promised them honesty. Riot police stood shoulder to shoulder, shields raised against a storm of outrage as chants thundered like a heartbeat across the city. Inside the House of Commons, chaos reigned. MPs roared with fury, waving letters of no confidence, demanding that the Speaker strip the Prime Minister of authority. The chamber, usually a place of sharp debate but measured order, descended into chaos. Shouting matches erupted, insults flew across the benches, and the air vibrated with the sound of fury and betrayal. Even seasoned politicians admitted they had never seen Parliament so close to collapse. But the real drama was unfolding behind the closed doors of government. Inside Whitehall, senior civil servants made a choice that stunned the nation. They began quietly refusing to carry out orders they deemed unlawful. Permanent secretaries circulated secret memos declaring that their loyalty lay not with a rogue Prime Minister, but with the law, the Constitution and the Crown. The machinery of the state was turning against the man who still clung to power. The defiance spread further still. Defence officials quietly restricted Starmer's access to military systems, fearful that desperation might drive him to reckless action. Reports leaked that Britain's nuclear codes had been locked down, secured by senior commanders to prevent any unlawful use. It was a chilling revelation, a sign that the armed forces themselves no longer trusted their leader. For the first time in living memory, a Prime Minister stood isolated not only from his people and his party, but from the very institutions that upheld the state. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace could no longer remain silent. King Charles, cutting short his retreat in Balmoral, returned to London in haste. Constitutional advisers worked deep into the night, drawing up scenarios not seen since the 19th century. The royal prerogative to dismiss a sitting Prime Minister, a power untouched for nearly 2 centuries, was now back on the table. Palace insiders whispered of 3 possibilities: a private ultimatum delivered behind closed doors, a public rebuke at the state opening of Parliament, or most dramatically, a live televised address to the nation, declaring the government unlawful. What once seemed unthinkable was now being openly prepared. Beyond Britain's shores, the crisis reverberated with alarming speed. The White House issued a statement expressing grave concern about the collapse of constitutional order in London. European leaders convened emergency summits, terrified that Britain's turmoil would trigger financial chaos across the continent. The pound plummeted to historic lows, markets tumbled, and investors fled in panic. Even NATO officials whispered their doubts, questioning whether Britain's fractured leadership could still be trusted in a time of global crisis. At home, the rebellion inside the Labour Party intensified. Cabinet ministers who had defended Starmer just weeks earlier now drafted resignation letters, terrified of sinking with him. Some MPs took to the airwaves to demand his immediate departure, their voices trembling with fear and anger. Others worked in secret, plotting to install an interim leader, knowing that their party's survival was at stake. For many, the choice was brutal but simple: abandon their leader or be destroyed alongside him. Through it all, Starmer remained barricaded inside Number 10. His defiance, once seen as strength, now looked like delusion. He dismissed the Supreme Court's ruling as an establishment conspiracy. He described the protests as manufactured chaos, and he insisted against all evidence that history would prove him right, but history was already being written in the streets, in Parliament, in the courts, and in the palace. And the story was clear. Britain was sliding into a constitutional abyss, its democracy trembling under the weight of one man's refusal to let go of power. As night fell over London, the crisis reached its most dangerous stage. The Supreme Court had spoken, the people had risen, the state itself had turned against its leader. Yet still, Keir Starmer clung to the power, slipping through his hands. Number 10 became a fortress, its doors barricaded by loyal staff, its windows watched by security forces caught in the middle of history. Outside, the streets pulsed with rage. Protesters lit candles that flickered like stars against the darkness, chanting in one voice that echoed through the city. No one is above the law. Their fury was no longer about politics. It was about survival. It was about whether Britain would remain a nation of laws or collapse into the will of one man. Inside Parliament, exhaustion and fury boiled into open rebellion. Labour MPs whispered that the party was finished, its future poisoned by scandal and betrayal. Some described it as watching the death of Labour in real time. Opposition leaders, smelling blood, demanded immediate elections. The Speaker struggled to keep order as the chamber shook with chants, insults and cries for justice. Britain's government was paralysed, its leaders frozen by a crisis no one had imagined possible. At Buckingham Palace, the unthinkable was now openly prepared. Constitutional advisers placed 3 drafts before King Charles: a private ultimatum, a public rebuke, or a televised dismissal of the Prime Minister himself. Each option carried risks, each one promised to change history, and yet none could be avoided. For the monarchy, silence was no longer possible. The King's next move would decide whether Britain could steady itself or spiral into chaos. The world watched in disbelief. News networks broadcast live images of a nation tearing itself apart. Headlines screaming of Britain's collapse into constitutional crisis. Markets trembled. Allies whispered their doubts. Enemies celebrated. The United Kingdom, once a pillar of stability, now looked fragile, exposed, uncertain. And through it all, Keir Starmer refused to bend. His words, once symbols of calm authority, now dripped with desperation. He spoke of conspiracies, of enemies in the courts, of a coup against democracy itself. But his voice no longer commanded. It pleaded. It begged. He was no longer the saviour of Labour, no longer the man of principle. He was a leader abandoned, a figure of hubris, a symbol of betrayal. The rise that began with promises of integrity had ended in a fall that threatened the very soul of Britain. The Supreme Court had delivered its ruling. The people had spoken with their fury. The institutions of state had rebelled. And yet the future remained uncertain. Would the monarchy step in and remove him? Would Parliament find the strength to strip him of power? Or would Starmer drag Britain even deeper into crisis, defying every law, every tradition, every plea for reason? History does not wait. It unfolds in real time. And now, Britain stands on the edge of transformation, whether into renewal or into ruin. The fall of Keir Starmer is not just the story of one man. It is a warning etched into history, a reminder of how quickly trust can collapse, how swiftly power can corrupt, and how brutally a nation can be shaken when its leader forgets that no one, not even a prime minister, is above the law. The final chapter has not yet been written. And so the question remains, should Keir Starmer finally resign, or will he drag Britain into a darkness it may never escape?